The other virtue ethical view that we want to talk about is exemplarist virtue ethics. And here I've got a picture of Linda Zagzebski. She's one of the more contemporary advocates for this view. Exemplarist virtue ethics says that an action is morally permissible if and only if a virtuous person in the relevant circumstances would perform it. So, unlike target-centered virtue ethics where we're thinking about the permissibility of an action based on the sort of character traits that it demonstrates, according to this view, the permissibility of an action depends on what virtuous people in the circumstances would do. So one thing you might wonder is like, what would a virtuous person do in situation X, Y, and Z? Would a virtuous person eat meat or would they not? The first thing we need to figure out is who the moral exemplars are. And when we're looking for these people, we're looking for people who lived a good life, right? Who flourished in the past or are flourishing right now. The reason for this is that, remember, virtue ethics is the goal is like living a good life, getting eudaimonia. And so we want to model our lives after the people whose lives that we think were good, the lives that we want to live. Now, some examples that we think about maybe are people like Jesus, or Harriet Tubman, Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, or even Mr. Rogers, right? These are people that we all look up to and admire for the way they live their lives. We think their lives were not only morally good, right, but they're good lives to live for the people living them. These are the kinds of lives that we want to live for ourselves. Now, the second thing we need to do is figure out what those people would do in the relevant circumstances. So, would these people eat meat? One thing that's hard to sort of figure out is like, what would Jesus do in contemporary America? Jesus, the biblical evidence suggests that Jesus at least ate fish, and so would he eat fish now? That's hard to say, right? We don't have Jesus walking around with us right now. Maybe some of these other people live closer to our time, right? Gandhi, for example, was a vegetarian, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't. So what would someone do in my circumstances, in my life? If we can ask these people, we should, right? The people we've picked, I've shown you here, right? They're sort of like some of the maybe morally best people out there. They're not people we run into every day. But exemplarist virtue ethics doesn't say, we've got to find the best people. You might have people around you every day that are moral exemplars, people who you look up to, people like your parents or your grandparents, aunts and uncles, friends who you admire and want to act more like. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I have a fellow grad student at CU Boulder who I really admire the way he taught, Dan Lowe. We've actually read a paper of his earlier this semester. Sometimes when I teach, I just think, what would Dan Lowe do here? And that's a guide to what I think I should do. Now, one problem with this view is, what do we do when moral exemplars disagree with these role models when they would do different things? So I just mentioned a second ago, right, like that Gandhi was a vegetarian, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't. What do we do about something like that? Well, one thing to note is that these people were in different circumstances, so maybe it's just the circumstances that explain the difference. When faced with like injustices, Harriet Tubman, Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. all did different things. So Harriet Tubman was one of the abolitionists, right, who worked with the Underground Railroad. Gandhi staged a hunger strike to oppose the British rule in India. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. obviously participated in numerous nonviolent protests to end slavery. And when we look at the facts about contemporary factory farming, we might think, well, Harriet Tubman, Gandhi, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would all do different things. Maybe Harriet Tubman would free the animals, Gandhi might stage a hunger strike. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Might organize a nonviolent protest. So what am I supposed to do, given that all those people would do different things? You might feel like virtue ethics isn't giving us that much guidance. One solution, and this is suggested by a number of authors, but in particular Russ Shafer Landau, whose textbook I use in some of my other classes, he points out that we can just sort of distinguish between some different situations. So if no moral exemplar is going to do the act, then that act is wrong. If some moral exemplars would do it, then it's permissible. So, how I respond to factory farming, maybe, given that Harriet Tubman and Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would do different things, maybe any of those options is permissible. But if there's some act that all moral exemplars would do, then that act is going to be obligatory. It's something that I have to do. Now, before I finish this discussion of virtue ethics, I want to apply it to some questions. The first one is the damming of Hetch Hetchy Valley. So Hetch Hetchy Valley is part of Yosemite National Park. The picture you see there is what it used to look like, and then above you see what it looks like now. It was dammed, I think, in the relatively early 1900s, maybe 1930s-ish. They filled it with just tons and tons of water to supply water for the San Francisco area. Now, this was a pretty controversial thing. A lot of people thought that this was like one of the most beautiful valleys in the area, but it also served really great as a dam. And so what should we do in a case like this where people's interests in getting water conflict with sort of the natural beauty of a particular area? When we evaluate the morality of any act, including this one, virtue ethicists can ask two questions. So one of those questions is about what virtuous people would do. Would virtuous people do the act in the relevant circumstances? Would they dam Hetch Hetchy Valley? Intuitively, I think virtuous people wouldn't dam this beautiful valley, except in the most exceptional circumstances. So one thing virtue ethicists are known for is they don't give us clear principles. There's no obvious answer to these questions. So instead we just think, what did virtuous people at the time, people we look up to for their insight on sort of a variety of other similar issues, see what they would have said. So someone like John Muir, and who was in charge of the Sierra Club, I believe he was in charge of the Sierra Club at that time, they vigorously opposed the project and thought that this was wrong, that it was destroying the natural environment. So when we think about it in that context, we might think, no, virtuous people wouldn't have dammed this particular valley. But if we're sort of unsure, right, about like, well, is John Muir the right person to think about? Or would somebody else be a better sort of exemplar to look to? We can go back to this question about, is this act consistent with the virtues? Is it overall virtuous? We can think about the cardinal virtues like courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. We can look at some of those environmental virtues that Sandler talked about. And here, this act doesn't seem consistent with the virtues. It seems to demonstrate hubris, like people know what's best and that we're in charge of nature. It demonstrates a kind of indifference to nature and the natural beauty, and it's selfish, right? It seems like we're privileging what's convenient for us or what's best for humans over what's best for animals and the natural environment in this particular area. So I don't think that in many cases like this, virtue ethics isn't going to sort of give us a clear, like obvious answer, but it can give us a bit of an insight when we look to these role models and virtues. The other thing I want to say before moving on from this slide is that when it comes time for you to use virtue ethics to evaluate an act, I'd like you to go into a little bit more depth than I've gone into here. So, talking about John Muir saying he opposed the project, you might want to sort of explain what the reasons are. If you talk about the particular virtues or vices that are demonstrated, you might say why it's hubristic. Why does it demonstrate indifference? Why does it demonstrate selfishness? I've said a little bit about that, but you would want to write that out on your homeworks. Another thing I think that you can do is potentially use these explanations in conjunction with each other. So if we wonder what virtue ethics would say, we might say a little bit about what virtuous people said about it, and then the sorts of character traits that it demonstrated. So John Muir and the Sierra Club opposed the project. Why? Maybe because they thought that the project suggested or demonstrated hubris and indifference and selfishness. So you can use the two kind of versions of virtue ethics together to get a more satisfying explanation. And to close, I just want to look at a few more cases, right? Factory farming, right? What would a virtuous person do? Would a virtuous person buy and eat factory farm meat? I think this is a complicated question, right? In most everyday circumstances, my inclination is to think that virtuous people wouldn't buy and eat factory farm meat. And the reason for this is because I don't think virtuous people would support the factory farm meat industry. Wouldn't support animals living in these kinds of conditions. And integrity is a virtue that seems to require them not to support things that they themselves don't endorse. So when you buy and eat factory farm meat, you endorse this system, and a virtuous person, I don't think, would do that. But that leaves open the possibility that there might be certain cases in which a virtuous person would eat factory farm meat. If you go over to a fancy dinner, for example, and your friends are offering you meat, then you might just go ahead and eat it, even though you don't necessarily support it, because this one value, the value of friendship and that relationship, being a generous guest, maybe that requires you to do something like eating factory farm meat on a particular instance. But that's a separate question from whether or not you should, eat factory farm meat every day. What about the zoos, right? Would virtuous people work at zoos? Would they visit zoos? Again, these are complicated questions. The virtue ethicist is going to say, maybe deontology and utilitarianism are a bit too simple. And the way we need to evaluate acts is really by thinking about, well, what's motivating the work that we're doing? If we work at a zoo just because we want to make money, well, that's not very virtuous. But if we work at a zoo because we think the zoo is doing really important and valuable work, and by working at this zoo, I can help preserve the environment, well, then maybe your motivations are good and that is permissible. It might also depend on the particular species, right? So there might be certain species of animals that can flourish in zoos. There might be others that can't. And so, again, I think this is where virtue ethics kind of flexibility works in its favor. It can say, some kinds of zoos or some kinds of activities in zoos, visiting zoos on certain occasions, right, can be permissible, but that doesn't mean it always is. And we're sort of looking for some distinctions between kinds of zoos and that sort of thing. Bullfighting, what about that, right? I think the virtue ethicist, insofar as my inclination, right, is to think that bullfighting is just cruel. There I'm appealing to a vice that I think watching a bullfight or participating in bullfighting demonstrates. But there might be other sort of values that are significant, like the cultural values, the artistic values of bullfighting. Maybe there's something there that the virtue ethicist can appreciate, even if at the end of the day, the sort of harm and suffering it causes to bulls is problematic. One more case that I want to look at is the elephant management dilemma, right? So it seems like elephants are going to dominate this landscape and destroy the ecosystem if left unchecked. So we've got to kill some elephants. If that's true, right, then the virtue ethicists, I think in a way, they can say that, right? They can say it's permissible to kill elephants, but they think that we need to be motivated to do it in the right way, right? If we just go out and laugh about it and shoot elephants, that's maybe, we're doing an okay thing as far as the ecosystem's concerned, but we're doing it in the wrong way. We're doing it in the wrong spirit with the wrong sorts of motivations. I think the virtue ethicist is also going to think about, well, how exactly, do we go about culling the elephant population? One issue raised in the elephant dilemma, the elephant management dilemma piece is like, which elephants do we kill? Do we kill men, male, not men, male elephants because they're more independent, or do we kill family groups? So elephants seem to grieve, and so it might be best if we're going to kill one elephant from a particular family group that we just kill all of them so that we don't kill like 10 elephants from 10 different family groups, but rather we kill 10 from one family group. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's the right solution. I'm just saying that a virtue ethicist is not going to just say, well, killing elephants maximize utility, so let's do it. They're going to think about how do we do it in the right way, at the right time, with the right motives. The last thing I want to talk about with virtue ethics is that virtue ethics, it changes not just the things that you would do, but it changes the way you see the world. So let's take this car here. I think it's a Hummer, if I remember correctly. So when you see a Hummer, what do you think? Do you think, oh man, that's a cool looking car. That's got a lot of power. Whatever. I would look great in that, or that would drive awesome. Those are one kinds of things that you can think. But if we're developing character, if we're working to be more environmentally conscious, for example, when we see a Hummer, we're not going to think of those things. We're going to think, oh man, that's bad for the environment, or it's really guzzling gasoline. It's wrong. Maybe it's wrong. It's problematic to drive that around just for fun. So it changes again as I think the book talks about this, is that integrating effects of virtue, as we start to act in certain ways, we start to see the world differently. Here's a hamburger, right? And one thing we might see this as is like food or like a really tasty treat. But other people might say what they see is animal flesh. Before I was a vegetarian or a vegan, other people would talk about meat as animal flesh. And I always thought that was like really kind of bizarre. Like, why talk about it in that way? It's meat, right? It's not flesh. But one thing you might think is that as you stop eating meat, as that becomes something that you don't eat all the time, you come to see meat in a sort of different context, right? It's not just food, but rather that's part of an animal. And when we look at it in that lens, the activity of eating hamburger becomes a different kind of thing. Finally, here we've got what we might all say is like a tree, but just to see it as a tree is to miss out on a lot of things that the tree does, right? The tree serves as a habitat for animals, insects, bugs. It serves as a habitat for maybe birds and squirrels, things like that. So that's home, right? It's not just a tree, but it's home to certain animals. We might also think about it as life-giving insofar as it provides oxygen for humans, and it benefits the climate insofar as it's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So when we look at a tree with this environmental lens, right, we're seeing something very different than the way we see a tree. If we haven't like developed certain character traits, if we haven't learned to care about certain things. And so at the end of the day, what the virtue ethicist says is that as we start to care more and more, as we develop these virtues, we'll start to see the world in a different way, and that's going to affect how we live. All right, that's the end of this lecture. Hopefully you've got a better sense of how virtue ethics works and are able to apply it on the homework.